Section 17, Chapter 11 of the Life and Adventures of Kit Carson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Green in Tampa, Florida. The Life and Adventures of Kit Carson by DeWitt C. Section 17, Chapter 11. Kit Carson is sent overland as bearer of dispatches to Washington. The preparation and the start. The journey. Privations and sufferings. Meeting with General Kearney. The general takes Carson as his guide and sends on the dispatches by Fitzpatrick. The march. Arrival at Warner's Ranch. Mexicans on the road. Preparations for a battle. The battle. Disastrous consequences. Kit Carson and Lieutenant Beale offer to run the lines of the Mexican sentinels and carry information to San Diego of Kearney's critical position. The daring undertaking. The sufferings they encountered. Their arrival. Reinforcements sent out. Lieutenant Beale is delirious from the privations he has undergone. General Kearney and his command finally reach and join the other American forces in California. On the 15th day of September, 1846, Kit Carson was placed in the command of 15 men, with orders to make an overland journey to Washington as bearer of very important dispatches. At the time of which we write, there was no steam communication as now, via the two great oceans. Consequently, the intercourse between our brave countrymen in California and the government at Washington was attended with extreme difficulty. Fortunately, Fremont had in Kit Carson just the man to make such a journey through an enemy's country. Kit Carson was instructed to use his utmost endeavors to make the journey in 60 days, which was no small undertaking when we consider the great distance to be traveled over and the obstacles that lay in his path. He undertook it, however, with a determination not to be easily frustrated. By judicious management and watchfulness, Kit was making good progress, and had reached a point within 2 days' travel of the copper mines in New Mexico, without being in any way annoyed. Here he came into full view of a village of Apache Indians, who were then, as they nearly ever since have been, at war with the Americans. He had been discovered by these Indians, and there was but one true way to act, which was not to show the white feather by attempting to evade them. Fremont's dispatch-bearer had not the least idea of that. He was too well schooled in Indian stratagem to be outmaneuvered, so he rode on as if nothing had happened, until he came to some timber that lay within 100 yards of their village, when he halted. At first, the Indians were disconcerted at the boldness of the whites, and were showing it by hurrying to and fro, either for the purpose of leaving, or to be better prepared to offer fight. On arriving near enough so to do, Kit Carson called to the savages, and informed them that his party were friends, and wished a parley. To this an assent was given, when Kit made them understand that he and his men were simply travelers en route for New Mexico, that they carried the olive branch of peace with them, and had come among them bearing it, in the hopes of being able to exchange their fatigued animals for others that were fresh. With this the Indians were satisfied. Therefore Carson chose a camping ground for himself and men, and selected the site so that they could best contend against the treachery of the red men, should they attempt any. When the camp was arranged, the Indians were allowed to come in, and soon after the trading commenced, which proved to be very successful, for the men obtained very good riding animals in place of their old ones. Their intercourse with this band of Apaches closed early the next day, when both parties bid each other good-bye on the most friendly terms. A few days more of travel brought Kit Carson and his men to the first Mexican settlement which then stood in their road. Their arrival in the town happened very opportunely, having for the past few days been suffering severely from hunger, They had started from California with but a small stock of dried meat and corn, not being able conveniently to carry more without impeding their progress. Therefore, they were left to depend on their rifles. Game they found to be scarce, and in a short time their meat was expended. Being reduced to the corn, they were, as a matter of necessity, very sparing of it. The maize was parched, and for several days they derived their entire subsistence from it, though, on account of the short allowance, they but poorly satiated their appetites. About the time succor appeared to them in the shape of this Mexican town, even the maize was nearly used up. They were delighted to reach a place where they would be able to replenish their provisions. It was well known to their commander that, as a dernier resort, he could kill and live upon his riding animals. But in so doing he would cripple his means so much that the business he was on might prove a failure. While so much depended on it, he felt that he ought not to leave any other means untried before resorting to such a procedure. It was true the Mexicans at that time were at war, but there were scattered over New Mexico, in almost every town, former friends of Kit Carson, who would, he felt confident, serve him in the hour of trial. At the first ranch they came to, they halted and made a rest of 2 or 3 days, while Kit employed himself in purchasing supplies, in which he succeeded beyond even his expectations. It was while obeying instructions in traveling as fast as possible that one day, the 6th of October, 1846, the party discerned something which at first looked like a mere speck moving on the prairies. Watching it with intense anxiety, the little speck increased in size until they saw it emerge, as it were, from the apparent junction of the heavens with the earth, and form a visible line. As the front of this column came nearer to view, they discovered that it was a strong detachment of United States troops. The truth was now evident to them all, that this was an expedition sent out by government to operate in California. Spurring on their animals, Kit and his men soon met the advance guard of the soldiers, and learned that their commander was General Kearny, who was further back in the lines. On coming to the general, Kit Carson reported himself, informed him of the business he was on, and also furnished him with all the intelligence in his power in reference to the disposal of the American forces in California, besides detailing to him what had already been accomplished in that quarter. After due deliberation, General Kearny determined to send Mr. Fitzpatrick on to Washington with the dispatches, and to order Kit Carson to join him as guide. In fulfilling his duty, he well knew that Kit would be invaluable to him. Acting on this decision, he sent for Kit Carson, and informed him of what he wished him to do. Kit Carson replied, "As the general thinks best." The fact was that Kit well knew he could be of great service to the command, and he was too honest not to confess it, though he was now nearly in reach of his happy home and its loved inmates, from whom he had been so long separated, and whom he fondly wished to see. In facing about, Kit took upon his shoulders the prospect of encountering fearful dangers, but he undertook his new duties without allowing a murmur to escape his lips, and without even asking additional pay, though, had he but mentioned it, the general could not have well refused the demand. A noble motive engrossed Kit Carson's mind. He has ever labored to win and wear the confidence and respect of his countrymen, being ambitious to leave a name behind him that shall be an honor to his friends and family. On the 18th day of October, 1846, General Kearny and his command left the Rio del Norte in New Mexico. The services of Kit Carson in directing the route proved the wisdom of General Kearny in making the change in the bearers of dispatches. So true was Kit Carson's guidance that the command traveled with so much dispatch as to reach Warner's Ranch in California on the 3rd day of December following. From this place it took up a line of march for San Diego. While on their march, news was brought in by their spies that a strong command of Mexican Californians had taken up a position on their route, evidently awaiting their advance with the view of attacking them. This occurred on the 6th day of the same month. General Kearney made no change in his route, but advanced to within 15 miles of the enemy's encampment. Here he commanded a halt. A reconnoitering party, consisting of 15 dragoons, commanded by Lieutenant Hammond, was sent on in advance to note the position and force of the enemy. He proceeded upon the duty, but was discovered by the Mexicans. Nevertheless, he fortunately succeeded in making his observations previous to being seen. His report to General Kearney, among other facts, stated that these Mexican soldiers had strongly established themselves in an Indian village. General Kearney determined without delay to attack them. Orders were given to resume the march, and by 1 o'clock the next morning, the American soldiers had fastened all their packs on their mules, and were themselves mounted and ready for the command to move. The order came without delay, and the little army was immediately in motion. 14 miles of the space which separated the two parties were passed without interruption. When within 1 mile of the Mexican position, the advanced guard of the Americans suddenly came upon a small advance guard of the Mexicans, who were evidently posted to watch their approach and guard the road. As soon as they were discovered, the trumpets of the dragoons sounded, in quick succession, the orders to trot and to gallop. The Americans were so prompt in making their charge that they came upon the Mexicans, when a sharp skirmish ensued in which several of the enemy were killed. The remainder of the outpost were driven in, bearing the news of the attack to their friends. Captain Johnson, Kit Carson, and 15 American soldiers formed the attacking party in this affair. They had been ordered to secure the loose animals belonging to the enemy. In this they failed, the animals being too strongly guarded, and because upon the first alarm they were driven out of harm's way. This attack, however, proved to be the commencement of a serious fight. Seeing that his orders could not be obeyed in regard to the animals of the enemy, Captain Johnson and his party joined a party under Captain Moore. The force of the latter consisted of 25 American volunteers from California, who had attached themselves to General Kearney's command since its arrival in the country. Moore's command also comprised parts of 2 companies of United States dragoons. Captain Moore had been ordered to make an attack on the center of the enemy in order to cut their forces in two, and thereby cause confusion in their ranks. As has been stated, Captain Johnson, with his little force, joined Captain Moore in making this attack. While the charge was in progress, and when within 100 yards of the Mexican camp, Kit Carson's horse, occupying a leading position in the column of attack, accidentally fell, and threw his rider with such force as to break the wood part or stock of his rifle into several pieces, rendering it useless. His position for a short time was precarious. Being foremost in the charge when the accident happened, the whole troop of horse came galloping over him as he lay upon the ground. His escape was almost a miracle. When the last horseman had passed, Kit arose, and was quite happy to find that he had received only slight contusions, which did not in the least impair his movements or strength of body. Casting a hasty glance over the field, he discovered a dead dragoon, not far distant from the spot where he himself had fallen. Instantly running up to the poor fellow, he relieved him of his gun and cartridge box. Being once more armed, he rushed forward at the top of his speed, and plunged into the thickest of the fight, which was then severely contested. Captain Johnson and several of the more advanced soldiers had been killed by the bullets of the enemy, almost at the same instant that Kit Carson's horse had fallen. It is not at all unlikely, therefore, that the accidental falling of his horse had been the means of saving Kit Carson's life. After a desperate and deadly conflict, Moore and his men dislodged the enemy, causing them to retreat. They were followed by the Americans, but unfortunately for their complete success, the large majority of the latter were mounted on mules. These, when the firing commenced, became almost unmanageable. But 40 of the entire command of General Kearney were mounted on horses, and these were none the best for cavalry purposes, having been but recently broken to the saddle. They had been captured since the arrival of the American forces in the country, from a party of Mexicans who were en route to Sonora by Lieutenant Davidson and 25 dragoons, assisted by Kit Carson. By the uncontrollable actions of these stubborn mules, Moore's men became greatly separated and could not act in concert. This rendered the pursuit, so far as the enemy was concerned, nearly harmless. The Mexicans, quickly perceiving the condition of their assailants, and comprehending the chances which the apparent difficulty gave them, at once rallied and turned on their pursuers. The fight was renewed with most determined courage. The Mexicans fought with a bravery and success which turned the hitherto, comparatively speaking, bloodless victory of the Americans into a terrible slaughter. Every moment saw some brave dragoon yield up his life to the deadly bullets or blows of the exasperated Mexicans. Out of the 40 dragoons who were mounted on horses, 36 were either killed or severely wounded. Among the names to be added to the sad list already killed was Captain Moore, as brave a man, says Kit Carson, as ever drew breath in any service. As fast as the scattered American soldiers could reach the scene of carnage, they joined in the battle. But the Mexicans, elated by their success, fought like demons, and seemed to sweep everything before them. General Kearny, seeing his officers thus shot down, drawing his sword, placed himself at the head of his remaining forces, and though severely wounded, he made a desperate attempt to cause the enemy once more to retreat. At this crisis of affairs, Lieutenant Davidson arrived on the ground with 2 mountain howitzers. Before he could get his guns unlimbered and ready to commence firing, nearly every man he had to work them was shot down, being either killed or badly wounded. Following up their success, the Mexicans charged right up to the guns, and with the lasso unerring in their hands, captured the horses attached to, and on the instant made off with one of the guns. On reaching a distance of 300 yards, they halted and prepared to turn the fire of the howitzer upon the Americans. From some unaccountable reason, it would not go off. Lieutenant Davidson did his utmost to prevent the loss of this gun, and after several narrow escapes from dangerous lance wounds, as his clothing and saddle sufficiently attested, he was finally stricken down, and nearly gave his life a sacrifice to his heroism. After being thus badly cut up, and with not more than 1 or 2 officers left who had not been either killed or wounded, while the men had been handled with equal severity, the Americans were obliged to take refuge at a point of rocks which chanced to be near where their advance had been defeated. The rally was made at this place. The Mexicans, however, did not venture to attack them. Both sides were apparently weary of fighting for that day. The firing ceased, and soon after that, night closed over the scene of the battlefield. These California Mexicans, previous to the war with the United States, were considered by the mountaineers as the bravest Spanish blood in the Mexican provinces. During the war, they proved that they had not been overestimated, as they met their foes at the commencement of hostilities with a determination to win or sell their lives dearly. The reason of this difference of courage in their favor over their countrymen, who inhabited the internal states, is supposed to be owing to their opportunities for intercourse with the bold mariners from different countries who visited them in ships for the purpose of trade. This commerce consisted in the transporting into the country of such articles as arms, ammunition, groceries, and dry goods, for which were bartered hides, tallow, and furs. The currency of California at that time was hides, which were estimated as so many dollars. The raising of cattle and horses was the leading employment of the people, and occupied most of their time. On the discovery of gold, these affairs underwent a change, and the rapid strides of civilization has left this people far in the minority. The horses of California were celebrated as being larger than the ponies of New Mexico, and also for being much fleeter of foot. The California rider at that time was looked upon as being unrivaled by those who had witnessed his performances. However, the intercourse between the two countries was very limited among the Mexicans, and it was difficult to find a New Mexican who had seen the Pacific. Their dialects were also slightly different, as much so as happens in the dependencies of any other country. It was fear of the Indians that put a damper on the travel between these adjoining districts. The society of the man who had had the boldness to make a journey to California from New Mexico was courted, he being considered a renowned traveler. His amusing stories of large ships and the men who managed them, and also of the great expanse of the ocean, amazed his auditors and made them deeply interested in his conversation and information. It has become a strange sight to look upon whole communities of men who have only heard of steamboats, telegraphs, railroads, and other great improvements and inventions of the age. Yet there are thousands of men living in the great interior of the North American continent who have only vague ideas of these things, and many there are who cannot realize them, but believe that they are fabulous stories, and will meet the narrator of them with equal wonders, which they manufacture to suit the occasion. To give a specimen, we remember one night to have tried to explain these advancements to an old Mexican of some 80 winters, while we were the guest of his house. He listened attentively, but evidently could comprehend but little that was said. We changed the subject, and began to describe to him the great beasts of the forest, such as the lion, the tiger, and the elephant, and soon found that we had struck the theme which pleased him. In reply, he told us that in his younger days he himself was a famous hunter, and that on one occasion, while on the chase, he met Adam, who, he informed us, was the greatest hunter of his age. We were somewhat surprised to hear this old man thus annihilate time and space, but not more so than when we heard him relate the conversation that passed between himself and Adam. It was both short and sweet. The Mexican demanded of Adam what was the particular game he was seeking in these parts, and the reply was deer. He said that he wished to kill a few choice bucks in order to get their skins to clothe Eve with, and hence he had come to the Rocky Mountains. The flavor of this yarn was so good, I attempted to try the old man on another adventure, by asking him if he ever, by chance, in his travels, met the Evil One. Immediately he informed me that at one time that gentleman lived in a salt marsh, which is to be found in the valley of San Luis. The object of his staying there was to watch a very fine band of horses which he was raising nearby. The Indians and Mexicans one day determined to deprive Satan of his stock, and arranged things accordingly. But on coming upon the horses, they were surprised to find that they could not overtake them, and that the horses ran directly into the swamp and vanished by easily sinking out of sight. While looking for a path that led into this marsh, they were all at once scared nearly out of their senses by seeing the devil raise himself up in the midst of the bog. The sequel was that the Mexicans and their Indian friends retreated as fast as possible, and never stopped until they had reached a place of safety. My companions became vexed to think any man could perpetrate such a story on travelers who considered they knew a thing or two, and commenced quizzing the old gentleman by asking him what the Indians knew of Satan. But the old Mexican evaded the answer by taking down the little wooden cross which hung on the wall of the room, and expressed the desire to confirm the truth of his story by swearing to it. This, of course, was said to be entirely unnecessary. From it we had learned the lesson never to try to impress on the minds of the ignorant too weighty matters. This is true with the Indian also, for he is incredulous of anything beyond the grasp of his own mind, which fact is illustrated by the following incident. An American had some business to transact with a certain band of Indians, who were celebrated as being very treacherous. Being a bold man, he thought he would beard the lions in their den, and accordingly traveled alone to where the band was located. But instead of being received with open arms, as he expected, he was made a prisoner, and so held until it could be decided what was to be done with him. At last a council was formed, before which he was to be tried. The first question asked by the head chief was, "How do your white people get gunpowder?" The reply was instantaneous. "We sow it in a peculiar soil, and it grows up like wheat." This was responded to by a grunt from the examiner. A pause ensued, when the chief looked the captive full in the eyes, and thus addressed him: "Know you, young man, that the Great Spirit came into our camp this morning, And after resting a short time, he took yonder large hill, and placed it on the top of its fellow, and after leaving it there 2 hours, he returned it to its former site. He then bid his Indian children good-bye. "Young man, your tongue is split. One fork is for telling lies, and the other is for telling truths." This was enough to convince the white man that he had made a mistake, and that if he attempted to presume on too much knowledge, his scalp might soon be dangling on some lodge-pole. The Indians admired the brave and manly course he had pursued in coming to them single-handed, and this, with the importance of the business he came on, saved his life. The California Mexicans were so remote from their capital that, although they acknowledged their allegiance to the general government, yet they were accustomed in many things to act with great independence. Whenever a governor was sent to them, and would not conform to their rules and regulations, or made himself in the least obnoxious, he was immediately placed on board ship, with orders to take himself out of the country as fast as possible, which he never failed to obey in order to save his life. Attempts were made by the Home Department to make them suffer for these disobediences of the general laws. But in all of these contests the Californians came out victorious, and hence they believed that they were beyond the power of being vanquished. They were taught differently by the Americans. These few cursory remarks will serve to show the reader that General Kearny had no despicable foe to overcome and subdue. His care now was to attend to the wounded. There was no rest for his command that night, as during the hours of darkness his men were busy interring their dead, and looking after the wants of the sufferers. A sharp lookout also was kept on the movements of the enemy, who were continually receiving reinforcements. A council of war was held in the American camp, when General Kearny, after taking the advice of his remaining officers, decided to move on early in the morning, with the hope of meeting reinforcements. He had dispatched 3 men as bearers of dispatches to Commodore Stockton at San Diego before the battle, but whether they had been successful or not in reaching the Commodore, the general did not know. Just before the late fight, they had returned to within sight of their friends when they were taken prisoners by the Mexicans. The order of the march on the following day was as follows. Kit Carson, with a command of 25 men, proceeded in the advance, while the remainder of the now very much crippled band of soldiers followed after on the trail made by their guide. Steadily and compactly, these brave men moved forward, being continually in expectancy of a charge from the enemy, who would show themselves from time to time on the neighboring hills, and then again for a time disappear. During the previous day a Mexican lieutenant had his horse shot from under him, and he himself had been taken prisoner. On a favorable opportunity occurring, General Kearny ordered a halt to be sounded, when through a flag of truce he asked a parley. It being granted, he succeeded in making an exchange of the lieutenant for one of his expressmen. He gained nothing by this, for the man stated that he and his companions had found it impossible to reach their point of destination, and hence they had turned back. The maneuvering on the part of the Mexicans, which we have alluded to as consisting of making temporary stands on the hills, and then changing their positions as the Americans drew near to them, continued for the greater part of the day. Finally, as General Kearny and his men were approaching the water, where they intended to camp, and were not over 500 yards from it, down came the Mexicans, divided into 2 separate commands for the purpose of making a charge. They were at first warmly received by the Americans, who, after a time, were obliged to give way to superior numbers. But in doing so, they retreated in good order to a hill about 200 yards to their left. Here they halted, and determined to decide the battle. But the wary Mexicans, on seeing the strength of the position taken by their foes, declined to attack them, and drew off to a neighboring height, from which they commenced and maintained a deadly fire on the Americans. Captains Emery and Turner, with all the available dragoons, were sent to dislodge them. This they did in splendid style, after a sharp encounter, and when their companions saw them take possession of this position, General Kearny, with all his wounded and luggage trains, joined them there. Here a permanent resting place for the time being was made. In fact, the men had no other choice, as they were now pretty effectually used up from fighting, severe loss, and fatigue. The Americans found on this hill water barely sufficient for their own use, and were obliged to exclude the idea of sharing it with their animals. Although within sight of abundance of this much-needed article, yet they did not dare to drive the latter to it, for they were too weak to defend them from the assaults of the enemy. The situation of General Kearny's force was now critical in the extreme, as, besides the dangers that surrounded him, the men were reduced to living on their mules. That afternoon, another council of war was called, at which desperate efforts to be made for immediate relief were discussed. When every spark of hope had almost died within them, and when they were in a dilemma as to what still remained for them to do, Kit Carson was found to act as the reader has previously seen him act to parties almost similarly situated. The right man in the right place. Rising to his feet, he addressed a few simple words to those present, saying that he was willing to make the attempt of creeping through the Mexican lines. Should he succeed, he pledged his word that he could carry information to Commodore Stockton at San Diego, and thus bring them succor. No sooner had he made this proposition than he was seconded by Lieutenant Beale, then of the United States Navy, who, equally as brave and daring as Kit Carson, volunteered his services in the undertaking. This gentleman, since the time he first turned landsman up to the present date, has been adding fresh laurels to his fame. His recent career, in exploring new routes across the great western girdle of prairies and mountains, is so well known through his valuable and interesting reports as not to require recapitulation at our hands. His life has been one series of rare adventures, while to the scientific world he has proved a valuable acquisition. To the United States government his services are inestimable, and as an explorer he has but few equals. General Kearny at once accepted the noble and generous offers of these two men, knowing that if he waited until the following day and then attempted to leave the hill, the consequences would be most disastrous, for in so doing a sanguinary battle must certainly ensue, with the chances greatly against him. Having made the few preparations necessary, Kit Carson and Lieutenant Beale waited the setting in of night, under the cover of which they had both resolved to succeed in the performance of their mission or die in the attempt. Having got well under way, and while stealthily crawling over the rocks and brush, they found that their shoes would often, even with the greatest preventive care being taken, strike against the various impediments to their progress, and make sounds which might lead to their detection. To avoid this, they took them off, and pushed them under their belts. Slowly but surely they evaded the vigilant guard of the Mexican sentinels, who they found to be mounted and 3 rows deep, evidently being determined not to be eluded. So near would they often come to these Mexican sentinels that but a few yards would measure the distance between them and their enemies. Yet with brave hearts they crept along over the ground, foot by foot. They were almost safe beyond these barriers, when all their hopes came near being dashed to pieces. This alarm was caused by one of the sentinels riding up near to where they were, dismounting from his horse, and lighting by his flint and steel his cigaretto. On seeing this, Kit Carson, who was just ahead of Lieutenant Beale, pushed back his foot and kicked softly his companion, as a signal for him to lie flat on the ground, as he, Carson, was doing. The Mexican was some time, being apparently very much at his leisure, in lighting his cigaretto, and during these moments of suspense, so quietly did Kit Carson and his companion lie on the ground, that Carson said, and still affirms, that he could distinctly hear Lieutenant Beale's heart pulsate. Who can describe the agony of mind to which these brave hearts were subjected during this severe trial? Everything, the lives of their friends as well as their own, so hung on chance that they shuddered, not at the thought of dying, but for fear that they would fail in accomplishing what was dearer to them than life, the rescue of the brave men whose lives hung on their success. After quite a long time, the Mexican, as if guided by the hand of Providence, mounted his horse, and made off in a contrary direction from the one where these bold adventurers were biding their time to accept either good if possible, or evil if necessary, from the wheel of fortune. For a distance of about 2 miles, Kit Carson and Lieutenant Beale thus worked along on their hands and knees. Continually during this time, Kit Carson's eagle eye was penetrating through the darkness, ever on the alert to discover whatever obstacle that might present itself, on which was stamped the least appearance of danger. Having passed the last visible image in the shape of a sentinel, and left the lines behind them at a suitable distance, both men regained their feet and once more breathed freely. Their first thought was to look for their shoes, but alas, they were gone. In the excitement of the journey, they had not given them a thought since depositing them beneath their belts. Hardly a word had hitherto passed between these two companions in danger, but now they spoke hurriedly and congratulated each other on the success that so far had attended them, and thanked God in their hearts that He had so mercifully aided them. There was no time for delay, as they were by no means yet free from danger, though they thought the worst was over. Kit Carson was familiar with the country, and well knew the necessity of avoiding, for fear of being discovered, all the well-trodden trails and roads which led to San Diego, every one of which was closely watched by the enemy. He chose a circuitous route over rocks, hills, and wild lands. The soil was lined with prickly pear, the thorns of which were penetrating at almost every step deep into their bare feet, which, owing to the darkness and the thickness of the plants, they could not avoid. The town of San Diego was located many miles in a straight line from the point from whence they had started. But by the roundabout route they were obliged to travel, this distance was much lengthened. All the following day they continued their tramp, and made as much progress as possible. Their mental excitement kept them in good spirits, though from previous fatigue, the want of food during this time, and by the rapid pace at which they were traveling, they were putting their physical powers to their full test. Another night closed in around them, yet onward was their watchword, for they thought not of rest, while those behind them were in such imminent peril. Kit Carson's only compass was his eye, which served him so well that soon the dark outlines of the houses of San Diego could just be discerned. Both men were ready to leap with joy. They were challenged by the American sentinels about the town, and answered in pure English, "Friends," which same English was unmistakable proof to the guard from whence they came. On stating their important business, they were conducted into the presence of Commodore Stockton, to whom they related what we have tried to describe. Commodore Stockton, with his usual promptitude, immediately detailed a command of about 170 men to make forced marches in order to reach and relieve their besieged countrymen. With as much dispatch as possible, this force set out, taking with them a piece of heavy ordnance, which, for want of animals, the men themselves were obliged to draw, by attaching ropes to it. Kit Carson did not return with them, for it was considered that he had seen service enough for the present. Besides, his feet were badly swollen and inflamed from the rough usage they had recently been obliged to submit to. He graphically described the position of General Kearney, so that the relief party could have no difficulty in finding him. He remained to recruit in San Diego, though, had the Commodore expressed the least wish to have Kit Carson return, every man who knows him can bear witness with me that he would have been the last person to object, so long as there was life in his body. Unused then to such hardships and mental excitements on land as was his more experienced companion, Lieutenant Beale, from the trials of the service performed, became partially deranged, and for treatment was sent on board the frigate Congress, which ship lay in the harbor, being one of the vessels attached to the Commodore's fleet. 2 long years elapsed before the gallant lieutenant fully recovered from the effects of this adventure, which, for the bravery and unselfishness evinced in its planning, and the boldness with which it was carried out, without mentioning the good results it produced, was not excelled by any one feat performed during the Mexican War. Better than all, Had these two men known previously the poor rewards which were afterwards to be bestowed upon them by their government for this heroic deed, I hesitate not in saying that it would have had no effect in changing their purpose. The reinforcements sent out to meet General Kearney, by traveling both by day and night, soon reached and released him without coming in contact with the enemy. They kept a bright lookout, and were early apprised through their spies of what was transpiring among the Americans. Hence, as the naval brigade drew near, they retreated. The road being now clear, General Kearney, with his soldiers and the marines, marched on to San Diego, where his wounded men were comfortably housed, and received the attentions of skillful surgeons. End of Section 17, Chapter 11. Recording by Larry Green in Tampa, Florida.